Here we go. Okay, so we are on page 5, immutability. Immutability is that attribute of God. The word means unchangeable, or having the characteristic of being unchangeable, immutability. So sometimes it's said that God is unchangeable, or he possesses unchangeableness. And when we say that, what we're talking about is God in his essential being, in his nature and who he is unchangeable. And of course, that includes everything about him. And so what I've written, the short definition, he's unchanging and unchangeable in his being, nature, and purpose. And of course, you could also say in his, name any of his attributes, they're also unchanging. So God is unchanging. And the Bible teaches that, and teaches it a lot of different places. And I've listed some of them there. The first one is Numbers 23:19. Let's look at that. This is Balaam, who was not a believer, not Jewish, and he knew enough to know that if he sought God for a word from God, that he would only be allowed to say what God told him to say. So he has delivered a word previous to this, and the person he delivered it to did not like it, and has asked him to do a retake, to say, to ask God again and to give a word from God one more time. And so Balaam starts out with this: God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. He has said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? So, yeah, Mom.
I'm hearing that, besides the noise in my background, I'm hearing a lot of other background noise. I don't know if people need to mute themselves or what's happening, or if it's you.
It could be me. Let me try changing this again. Okay, can you hear me? Somebody say something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can't
Yes,
hear
I
you.
hear it.
Why is that?
I hear you, but I can still hear the noise.
Pausing. Okay, so Numbers 23:19, which we read, says that God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. And that whatever God has proposed to do, what he has said he will do it. And this is one of the passages that teaches quite clearly that God does not change. And the contrast is important to note there, that God is saying he's not like us. And so categorically, qualitatively different. He's not just, better than us on some scale of being, but he's completely different than us. He's not a human that he should lie. The second one is the second passage is 1 Samuel 15:29. And that says, so this is Samuel, and also the glory of Israel will not lie or have regret, for he is not a man that he should have regret. So this is another one of those passages that talks about the Lord's unchanging purpose. Once he has verbalized his purpose, we can count on it to come to pass. He won't change. And he says here again, and the contrast is made between God and humans. This passage is very interesting in the context, because, and we'll come back to it, because in 1 Samuel 15, it says in another verse that God regretted that he had made Saul king. And that's 1 Samuel 15. And here in 1 Samuel 15, in verse 29, it says, the glory of Israel will not lie or have regret. He is not a man that he should have regret. All right. Phew. Let's go to.
So in the NIV, it actually says that he doesn't change his mind. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind. So evidently change his mind and regret are symbiotic. For he is not a human being that he should change his mind.
Oh, that's interesting. So how did they translate verse 11?
I regret that I have made Saul king because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was angry and he cried out to the Lord all that night.
So verse 29 doesn't have any, the word regret is not in verse 29, correct?
Not in the NIV.
Right. That's interesting. What about verse 35?
Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel.
Okay, so this is interesting, even though it's off the topic of, I see my mom's laughing. It's off the topic of
her NIV probably says something else.
Oh, no.
Because I have a newer version.
Yeah. So why is it interesting?
I'm using ESV now.
Yeah. Does anybody know why it's interesting that
so Jane is changeable?
Yeah, Jane, she's changeable, right? So is her Bible translation.
Well, it's interesting that it says in verse whatever that God does not regret anything, and then a little farther down it says he regretted it.
Yeah, in the ESV it says that, right?
Well, it's when Becky's that used the word that said he regretted.
Oh, he only regrets it in verse 15 and 31 when talking about making Saul king. But in
35.
20, oh yeah, 35. But in 29, when talking about God's being, his character, it says he doesn't change his mind.
Well, so then he made Saul king, even though he regretted it at the very moment he did it. I mean, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, well, the NIV.
Obviously, he changed his mind.
Well, it's so the NIV is trying to avoid people from coming to that conclusion that God changed his mind, but it leaves open the possibility that God could still regret. So basically what it does is it avoids the problem created by, it's not the ESV that's creating the problem, but by the Hebrew, right? By the Hebrew of 1 Samuel 15 in verse 11, I'm getting my verses mixed up. Verse 11, right, and 35, it says that God regrets making Saul king. It says that in the ESV and the NIV and in the Hebrew. And also in the Hebrew in verse 29, it says God does not regret. And so you have a categorical statement in verse 29 about God. He does not regret. He has no regrets, never. And so the in the Hebrew text, you have these same words being used in these three places, and so it's not like there's it's obviously intentional. God is using these words with the intent that we see a conflict, right? That we see, oh, God did this and it's described as him repenting, but over here it says God doesn't repent, and then we're supposed to resolve that conflict, right, theologically, right? But the NIV just has opted to avoid the conflict.
I don't see that that's an avoidance of conflict though, because I don't see how you can do something. How you can do something deliberately that you regret as you do it. I mean, or regret that you're going to do it. Or, I mean, obviously you change your mind if you did it and then you regret it.
Well, I think we can all imagine, and maybe have all done things where we said, this, I believe, is the best course of action for right now, but I think I'm going to end up regretting that I did this, but I'm still going to do it because it's the best thing to do. And so we have a kind of a, and then later on, it turns out, yeah, that wasn't the best thing to do. And then we go, or maybe that's not the right way to say it. We turn out that it's painful for us. It turns out that it's painful for us. And so we have some regrets about it. It looks like everybody's frozen.
He's back.
Oh man, this is just okay. So I'm gonna just turn on my personal hotspot on my phone so that maybe my internet won't die. So I was talking a whole lot and probably you didn't hear any of it. That's okay. Because you were all pretty much frozen immediately after whatever you said, Mom. I remember what you said. Okay, so my response was something along the lines of, I think we can all imagine a situation, and maybe we've experienced a situation where we make decisions and we think about in the future, I might come to be hurt by this decision. But to me right now, it seems like the best decision to make. And so you make the decision, and then later on, as it turns out, you get hurt by it. It comes back to bite you. And you go and you look at the situation and you think, well, you know, if I was put in that same situation, I still would have done the same thing, even though I have regrets about doing it. And so I think what the NIV does is it attributes that human way of thinking to God and says, God, you know, it was a really good idea to make Saul king. There's nothing wrong when he did that, but he's come to regret it because, you know, now he knows more about Saul. And I don't think the translators of the NIV would actually want to articulate it like that. But if you don't think carefully, if we as the Bible reader don't think carefully, I think that type of scenario kind of helps us smooth over the problem created by using regret in all three instances by the ESV.
So I may not be remembering the story correctly, but it seems to me that God didn't want to have a king at all, that he didn't want to put a king in charge, but he went ahead and did it because everybody said, well, everybody else has a king. We should have a king too. We should have a king that we could see and can do for us. And, you know, and God already knew it wasn't going to go well.
Yeah, so
he didn't change his mind, but he went ahead and, you know, gave the people what they thought they wanted.
Yeah, there is, I think, it's the popular understanding is that God giving Israel a king was more like a concession. You know, it wasn't his perfect plan. You know, so sometimes people think of God and he has a perfect plan and he's got these next to perfect plans. And this was not the perfect plan to give Israel a king, and that God never wanted them to have a human king because God was supposed to be their king. And I've heard that teaching lots of times. However, it's not true. So if you go back to Deuteronomy 17, around verse 14. So when you come to the land Deuteronomy 17:14, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you and you possess it and you dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, not just the law he just gave, but the entire first 5 books of Moses. He will write for himself in the book a copy of this law approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. So this is a commandment section in Deuteronomy before there were even judges, where we're couple hundred years away from the first king. God says to them, you're going to want a king, and that's fine. That's totally fine. You can set over you the king I choose, and the king I choose can't do this, that, and the other thing, and he will do this, that, and the other thing. He will make a copy of this law. He'll read in it every day. He'll judge righteously. He'll have a just and righteous kingdom. He'll lead the nation basically in following the Lord. So the problem with the king that Israel wanted in 1 Samuel 8 was they wanted a king like all the other nations, a king who's powerful and leads us in battle and this and that. But God's basic requirement for a king was that he be the man that I choose, and that he be a godly man, and he be an Israelite. And he shouldn't try to get lots of horses. Okay, that's military might. Don't try to get lots of strength from the army. Don't get lots of wives, and don't amass excessive silver and gold. It's okay to have silver and gold, but don't just have piles of it laying around for no good reason. I know everybody's thinking about Solomon. He did all these things. So Solomon he probably read in the law, and he probably had a copy of it for himself, and he did administer justice, and he was righteous and all of those things for a while. But he also did these 3 things you shouldn't do. But anyway, so when you get to 1 Samuel and the people ask for a king, it's often portrayed as God wants to be their king. And so this is a rejection of God. And in fact, I think even the Lord says that to Samuel, that they've rejected me as king in that instance. But it isn't the fact that they got a king. It was the type of king that they wanted, which was the rejection of God. See, if they wanted this type of king in Deuteronomy 17, that's totally fine. But they didn't want a king like this. They wanted a king like, the king of the Philistines or something. So, Mom.
That's really helpful.
Oh, good.
And it would have been even more helpful if the text had said in verse 15 in Deuteronomy 17, you may indeed set a king over you, but
yeah.
But here are the conditions.
Yeah. So the other thing that's also really important when we think about things like this, like kingship. So some of you have been going through the Westminster Confession about the mediator. So what are the 3 offices of Christ? Does anybody remember the 3 offices? Mom's looking at her notes.
No, I'm not. I'm looking down where I can turn off the mute. Priest, king, and something else.
What is it, Mike?
Mediator.
Almost. Not mediator.
Prophet.
Prophet.
Prophet, thank you.
Right. So the thing that all
The
three
three
of these,
Ps.
the thing that these three offices have in common is that they are all the prophets, priests, and kings in the Old Testament that are legitimate have been anointed. They were anointed by God. So you're anointed to the office, and Christ or Messiah means the anointed one. That's what the meaning is. So when we think about Christ and typology and how and all of that, then it couldn't possibly be the case that God doesn't want them to have a king, because Christ is a king. And so the typology actually demands that there be Old Testament kings. Does that make sense? So yeah. So anyway, just I know that was kind of off topic, but I'm glad it was helpful. So we'll come back. We'll revisit 1 Samuel 15 in a few minutes after we go through the verses that explicitly say that God doesn't change. Then we'll come back and look at passages like this one where the text says God regretted it and changed his mind and stuff like that with God. So we'll see how to interpret those. So the next passage I want to look at is Psalm 102, verse 25 to 27. And Mom, you want to read that?
Yes. Of old you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will change them like a robe, and they will pass away. But you are the same, and your years have no end.
So the passage here from Psalm 102 is just basically a contrast between everything created and the creator, right? All the created things are going to change. They're going to perish. They're mutable. They can be mutated, they can disintegrate and all that. But God is not like that. He's not mutable. He's unchanging. He's the same, and he will be the same eternally, which is what's expressed by your years have no end. God doesn't have any years, but the idea is it's an anthropomorphic saying, right? We have years, but God is eternal. So he's eternal and he's unchanging, and that's good news for his people. Let's look at Malachi 3:6. This is probably the most famous passage on God's immutability. Malachi 3:6, the Lord speaking says, "For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore, you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed." What a great passage. Previous to this in Malachi, the Lord has said, I'm coming in judgment. I'm coming in judgment. But because I don't change, I'm not going to destroy you completely, even though you deserve it. So, and it isn't just because he doesn't change, but because he has made a commitment. He has said that he would send the Messiah through the Jewish people. That he would save the Jewish people from their sins. So he can't destroy them all. This guarantees a faithful remnant. And so the Lord says, I don't change. Doesn't matter what you do, I won't change. That's a really helpful thing. And then Hebrews 6:16 to 18. Becky, you have that?
People swear by someone greater than themselves, and the oath confirms what it is said and puts an end to all argument. Because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, he confirmed it with an oath. Did you say 18?
Yep.
God did this so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of the hope set before us may be greatly encouraged.
So there's a couple of things here about God. First, so the two things, does anybody know what the two unchangeable things are?
His word, is that one of them?
His word of,
His promises.
yeah, so his word of promise and his word of oath.
An oath, yeah.
Right. So the Lord makes a promise. So go back to 16, you see the two things there. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So there's the I swear to do it. I give you my word. I make this oath that I'll do it. So it's promise and oath. And then those two things, verse 17. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things, those two things, in which it is impossible for God to lie. Now there's the third thing, impossible for God to lie. We who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. Yeah, if we're not encouraged by that, there's something really wrong. And when God says, I'm going to do this, I swear on my life, I'm going to do this, and I never lie, it's impossible for me to lie, then we should be strongly encouraged to the point that we believe it's absolutely certain that God's going to do what he has said. And this is predicated, of course, on him being unchanging, right? So, so God is the God of truth, that's why it's impossible for him to lie. And he's almighty, so when he gives his word, there's nobody who can thwart him. So when he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. So he's unchanging in his purpose and unchangeable. It says, verse 17, at least in the ESV, it says, so when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose. Is that what the NIV says too? Does it say unchangeable?
Unchanging.
Unchanging.
Because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised. He confirmed it with an oath.
Yeah. So I guess they both say the same thing ultimately. I prefer the idea of unchangeable. But we know it's unchanging because God is unchanging, and we also know it's unchangeable because God is unchangeable. So ultimately they're the same thing, both rooted in the character of God. And so the application of all this, of course, is what the writer to the Hebrews says. We should be encouraged. We should hold fast to the hope that we have, to and that hope is that one day we will realize fully, the promises that God has made to us. And so we hold on to that because we know that God is true. So the last verse in this little section is James 1:17. Let's look at that. James 1:17, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Kind of a fancy, picturesque way to say God doesn't change. It's coming down to it. He's our Father. He gives us good gifts. He doesn't change. You might not deserve a good gift, but he gives you a good gift anyway, because he doesn't change. So all of these passages, they all basically say the same thing, but when you take them all together, you can see that throughout the Bible, when talking about God's being and his character, his nature, his purpose, it says these things never change. They cannot change. So not only do they not change, but they can't change. Impossible for God to change. So I'm sure that everybody already knew that, but it's great to always look at again. So those are straightforward declarations of God being immutable. There's also lots of declarations in the Bible that are metaphorical, and they state the same thing. And those are in the next section. And these are just some examples of where God is called a rock. And I think often when we read that God's called a rock, we don't stop to think about what's being emphasized here. But I think it's also very helpful whenever we come across some metaphor that we think about it and go, what is this really saying? What's trying to be communicated with this metaphorical name for God? So Deuteronomy 32:4. This rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. So this rock, so the idea that of God being a rock is, I mean, you could think of a lot of things about a rock. And we're not talking about a little stone, we're talking about a big rock, like the rock of Gibraltar or something like that, a big rock. When we talk about God being a big rock, I mean, you could say, well, he's hard, but that's not the metaphor. He's got sharp edges. He's really heavy. None of those things are what are being portrayed or conveyed here. The thing that's being conveyed is said in the second stanza. He's faithful. He's a God of faithfulness. He doesn't change. He does what he says. And he's unchanging. And so calling God the rock is a reminder to the Israelites that God is immovable, unchangeable, constant. So those are the things that we think about when we see that. In Deuteronomy 32:15.
Well, I think of it. I think of the rock too. Christ being the rock is being our sure foundation upon which we can have our faith in and stand upon.
Right. Yeah, and that understanding, I think, comes out in it's Matthew 7, right, where Jesus talks about the wise man building his house on the rock, and the rock there are the words of Christ and the person of Christ. And that's a slightly, that is true, that rock has that connotation too, a firm foundation. I think in these Old Testament passages that the main focus is unchangeableness or unmovableness, and which is also important in the sure foundation illustration. It's not moving with the sand, with the storm. So yeah, thank you, Shirley. So Deuteronomy 32:15, same chapter, 15. But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, stout, and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. So it's being used in the same way here. And then Deuteronomy 32:18, you were unmindful of the rock that bore you, and you forgot the God who gave you birth. So here brings in what Shirley talked about foundation, right? The rock is bearing them. The rock is carrying them. So they have an immovable, unchangeable foundation, which is sure, and yet they forget. They forget that God is, that those are the characteristics of this God. And they start thinking that their God is like the gods of the nations, or maybe not even as good. Let's go to 2 Samuel 2:22. That's not a good one. Let's go to Psalm 18:2. I'm going to skip over some of the passages I have there. Psalm 18:2 and also 31. David writing, the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. So David has this idea of the Lord as protector, and he likens that to a rock. He's using kind of a poetic imagination here, right? He's inside the rock, and he's saying, hey, look, I'm totally shielded. I've taken refuge in this rock. This is my stronghold here. I am completely saved because this rock is my fortress, and the enemies can't get in because David is inside. He's in the rock, and God is his rock there. So it has this idea of impenetrable. You cannot penetrate the rock. You cannot damage it or destroy it or chip into it or anything like that. Powerful. Psalm 18:31, who is God but the Lord, and who is a rock except our God? So all of these so far have the idea of unchanging, unchangeableness. Then the last one I want to look at is Habakkuk 1:12. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. Why won't the Israelites die? Because God is unchanging. He's their rock. Why will the enemies perish? Because God is unchanging. He's their rock. So these are just metaphorical ways of talking about God's unchangeableness, his immutability. And so I want to ask at this point, does anybody have any comments or thoughts about that? This is a useful doctrine, right? Yeah. So let's look at some passages where God is said to have changed his mind. We just read a bunch of passages that say God doesn't change his mind. God's unchanging. God doesn't regret stuff. So let's look at passages where it says God changed his mind and he regretted stuff. Let's look at Genesis 6:6. If you haven't been challenged with these verses yet, someday somebody will challenge you. They'll say the Bible has contradictions, and then they'll point to stuff like this. So it's good to know how to respond. Genesis 6:6, and the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Does the NIV say something different than that?
Not really. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled.
Okay. Yeah, so.
And it repented the Lord that he had made man on earth.
Right, King
And it
James.
grieved him.
Yeah, it repented the Lord and grieved him. Right, thank you, Shirley. So here we have God, ESV regrets. It grieves him. He's troubled in his heart. He repents, or it repented him, and he grieves. And so this sounds on the surface of it to be maybe not easily squared with the passages we read about God not regretting things and God not changing his mind, things like that. Does anybody see the problem? Is it just me? I see
Well,
the problem.
the problem is sin, and sin grieves the Lord, and sin will always grieve the Lord. So in that case, he will not change.
That's, yeah, we'll return to that. So let's look at the next one, Exodus 32. And that one is verse 10 to 15. So the people have been, having a big party down at the foot of the mountain, they took all this jewelry and melted it down, and wow, all of a sudden these 2 golden calves popped out, just amazing. And they started to worship him. And, Aaron is as surprised as can be that happened, right? He has no idea what happened there. Now God responds to that, and he says to Moses, "Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and that I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you." Here's the proposition. I'm going to wipe them all out, and I'm going to make you a great nation, right? You're a descendant of Abraham, aren't you? I'm going to make you a great nation. But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, with evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever." See how important it is to know what God has said? Moses says, "Wait a second, aren't you the same God who said this stuff?" Right? And
Yeah.
then,
I do think, but.
yeah, and the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, tablets that were written on both sides, on the front and the back. They were written. So, so here we have the Lord saying he's going to do something, and then apparently changing his mind about that. And so, there have been different ways that people have interpreted passages like this. The only conflict I'm concerned about right now is the conflict, apparent or real, between these passages and the other passages that we read about God not changing. 1 Samuel 15, we already read these, so I'll just go through them real quick. 1 Samuel 15:11, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And Samuel was angry, and he cried to the Lord all night. And then 1 Samuel 15:35, and Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. And then Jonah 3:10, I think that's the last one, Jonah 3:10. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it. So these passages are brought up. Some of them are more easy to explain than others, but these passages are all brought up by atheists and critics of the Bible, and they say, look, God changed his mind. Look, God relents. Look, God grieved. He regrets, and then these other passages say he doesn't change his mind and he doesn't regret. So you got contradictions. So go ahead, Mike.
One of those fun cases where you can tell them, don't take it so literally.
Yeah. No, you can. So, we do want to, and that is a good response, and we want to have a good response, and we want to, but more than that, not just, this isn't really about trying to get a response to the critic, right? It's about how to understand God's word and how to understand it accurately. And so there's this rule that's really important, that when we look at passages like the ones that we've looked at, so we looked at ones that said God doesn't change his mind. There were about 6 or 7 or 8 of those. And now we've looked at some examples where God appears to change his mind, says he changes his mind, says he regrets, etc. So when we look at those, what we want to do is we want to look at categorical statements that are about God's being. So descriptions of his nature or affirmations of what he is like in himself. So among those would be Malachi 3:6, I the Lord do not change, therefore you're not consumed. That's about him. Okay. In fact, all of the passages that God is not a man that he should lie or change his mind, that's about So what we're talking about is ontology. We're talking about God's being and human beings. Human beings lie. They change. God doesn't. So we're talking about the beingness or the nature. So we call those statements of ontology or statements of being. And all of the statements that we read in the very first section about God not changing or regretting, those are all statements about God's being, where God talks about himself, or the prophet says about God, about who he is. But all these other things are descriptions about what God does. So they're in a different category of statements about God. So we have statements about God that are about who God is, about his being. And then we have descriptive statements about how God acts, or how God describes his action, or how his action is described by a prophet or a psalmist. And the rule is that you always take the statements that tell you about the nature and being of God, you take those as primary, and you conform the other statements to them. Which much the same way as you would do with a human being. You say, well, a human being is fallible and finite and changeable and sinful. And then you would take that as guiding you when you hear a statement where it says, maybe a friend says, oh, this person, he never does anything wrong. So that's a description of behavior, but it is not a affirmation of character, right? So we know what human character is like, and so we take the human character description of human character and we make the other statement. We don't twist it or anything, but we understand it through the light of what we see about human character. So does everybody understand what I'm saying so far? Have I confused it? What do you think, Mom? Yep.
Well, I think I understand it.
All right.
I'm muted.
No, you're fine.
Not, okay. I'm just trying to wrap my head around it.
Okay, yeah, so it might help.
Because to me, how do you conform what God does to who God is if God does something that appears like he's changing his mind, but he doesn't change his mind? Right.
So we get back to then what we started with, and always when we're talking about God, we're going to have analogical language or accommodated language, or anthropomorphisms. So like Mike said, you're interpreting this too literally. Another way of saying that is that this is an anthropomorphism. If God were a man, his actions appear to be one of a man regretting what he has done. Another way that we can say that is to say that we look at when God says, I regret, like I regret that I made Saul king. And so God deposes him and puts David in his place, right? So we want to look at the effect. The effect is God removes Saul. So it goes like this: God appoints Saul, God removes Saul, God appoints David. Now, if a human being were doing that, we would say, oh, he changed his mind. He regrets that he made Saul king. And so now he's going with David, who's going to be a better king, right? So we're looking at the effect of that action. In anthropomorphic language, or anthropopathic language, when God is talking about regret or changing my mind or something like that, he's just describing the effect from the point of view of a person, of a human person. And so he's not claiming for himself regret. He's not saying, oh, this happened and now I'm sad. He's not saying that. He's saying, that he's not, God in his eternal nature never changes, doesn't change his mind, it doesn't have regret. I mean, he's perfect, and there's nothing that could be done that would take away from that and make him feeling a lack. And that's what you feel when you actually regret something. You're expressing a lack. So what he's just describing the passages, or when he says in the passages, I've regretted this, or I regret that I made people because they're sinful and now I got to judge them. This is a description of, it's an anthropomorphic way of describing what achieves this. We see the effect and we say, well, this is the way we would feel about this.
So these passages that say God regretted or God relented, this is a man talking about God. Have we come to passages where God says about himself, I regretted?
Yeah, the Samuel passages.
The Samuel passage?
Yeah, 1 Samuel 15:11.
God, or 10 actually,
Or is it 10?
where it's
Oh, yeah, okay.
11, they go together.
11.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, but 10 is where it says that the word came from the Lord to Samuel.
Saying, I regret. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So see how good my memory is. I can't remember 5 minutes ago.
That's okay. Yeah, so what I'm not actually saying that because a human described God in these words that we can take them as anthropomorphisms, because God describes himself using anthropomorphisms.
Okay.
But it is, I mean, it's really interesting that this verse 11, I regret that I've made Saul king, is in the exact same chapter of I don't regret. And so you look at one and you go, well, which one of these is about his character? They both can't be about his character. That would be a contradiction. They're both about his character. And so we already know that God is unchanging from just the idea of God, just the idea of God being perfect and infinite. But also from other passages, we know that. And so the 1 Samuel 15:29, where God says, I don't regret, I'm not a man. So he's comparing humanity with his own nature and saying, I'm not like you.
Yeah.
I'm not like you. This is an interpretive key to the other two passages in this chapter that say God regretted. Even if God said it himself, I regret. It's not a description of his inner being, but a description to Samuel or to us of a way a man might act, of what we understand. So
A way for us to understand what is happening, because it also goes on to say in 11 that Samuel was angry, and I had to read it a couple of times. Samuel wasn't angry that God said, I regret. He was angry that Saul turned away from God and didn't carry out his instructions.
right. Yeah.
So it was a way for Samuel to, kind of get his arms around what was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of too, like what I see, you kind of said some of it too, Chuck, and what you've been saying. In verse 11, I see that as it repented Christ of God, that it's because of Samuel's disobedience. And I see it that, sin does grieve God even today. It grieves him when we sin. And I think that's where that comes from. Whereas that over here in 29, well, you kind of touched on this because it's exactly kind of what I was thinking too. The strength of Israel, which is God, will not lie or repent, for he is not a man that he should repent. In other words, he to me, I see him as being the perfect person that he is, even when he was a man, he was perfect, sinless. So he really has nothing within, like you say, his character to repent of. And I think that's what this is talking about. This part is his character, whereas this other part is it grieves his heart because of our sins. In this case, Saul's sins of disobedience. Am I making sense?
You are making sense. It is a different, different point than what I was making. I think that the attribution of emotions to God, like grief, and we might be getting ahead of ourselves to the outline, but so God is unchanging and unchangeable. And if we start there, then we end up with God doesn't I have to be careful how to say this. What I guess what I'm trying to say is that God doesn't whatever grief means when God says he grieves, it doesn't mean what we experience. It's absolutely nothing like what humans experience. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't imply any kind of change in God, or any kind of lack, or any kind of, oops, I messed up and now I should do something else, or any kind of feeling of loss, or any kind of actual experience of any loss. And so whatever grief means, if it means something tangible, or something when applied to God, it doesn't mean any of the things that it means when we use it of ourselves. And I think what it comes down to is that God does not experience that emotion of actual grief. Because the only way we can describe grief is through our experience, but God doesn't experience that the same in any way like we do.
Did we already cover impassible?
I think we might have talked about it,
because that seems to be heavily related to this. Is God is impassible? He doesn't have passions or feel. So it's like
Right.
convention. In order for us to understand what our relation to, how our relation, based on what we do, our relation to God changes because of how we change and
Right.
what our actions, right? And for us to understand what's going on, you have to sometimes attribute what the emotional effect of the person on the other side would be thinking if they were not impassible.
Right. Yeah. So, and regarding that, the passages we read from Job, where one of Job's friends says to Job, if you sin, does that hurt God? And of course, the answer to that is no. Right? If you're good, does God benefit? No. And as Becky then observed, and everything that God does is for us, right? For our benefit, because we benefit. But God is not made better or more complete because of our obedience, and nothing is taken away from him or detracted from him when we sin. And so, right. So when we look at these passages about changeability, where it says God regrets, God changes, we have to then interpret them through the lens of the passages that talk about his being. Say he doesn't change, and he doesn't.
And we have to come to agreement on the words we use to describe. You just used the word hurt. And in that case, hurt was, does it damage God? Does it hurt God? As opposed to, is he, emotionally hurt? Because there's two different ways of looking at that. And I think when we talk about words that have several different meanings that we can get lost in our assumption of what it is that you're saying. Not you, Chuck, but whoever is doing the talking.
Yeah.
We make assumptions based on our own experience. So when you say, does that hurt God? Well, does that mean, does it damage him or does it grieve him?
Right.
Mhm.
And
And
probably,
either one of those would not be, the answer would be no.
right.
But the audience, you could have, two different people, one thinks that you mean damage and one thinks that you mean, grieve.
Right.
And even though the answer is no, we tangent off, think about something for a while, and then we come back again. And
Mhm.
we may have missed the whole point.
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you for that. Your words are important, and understanding what we're saying and what we're hearing. And thanks, Mike, for bringing up impassibility. I know that I've mentioned it a couple of times early on. I don't know if we spent much time thinking about it or talking about it. And I was kind of looking through the outline, and I don't see it, except maybe in a footnote. But since you brought it up, I'll just rehearse what that is so that we understand it. So impassibility, what that means is that God does not, we could say it like this: God is not passionate. God doesn't experience passions. Now, in our culture today, passions is used as a kind of a good thing. I'm passionate about this, I'm passionate about that. And so we are alarmed when somebody says God is not passionate, God doesn't experience passion. We immediately think, what, God's not excited about things, or he's not loving. What are you saying? So what's being said there is that we have to remember these terms have a long history. So impassibility has a long history, going back to I was just reading quotes from some of the church fathers from the 2nd century, like 140 AD, where they're talking about God being, impassible. And so, they go way back. And passion in this discussion means, connotes suffering. So like Christ's passion, the Easter week, that's his passion. And it's Christ's suffering. And so passion has, in theological terminology, has this idea of suffering under something. Christ suffers
Something
under,
external, like
something
having been affected by something external to you.
Right, something external to you, puts you under it, changing you, and kind of directing your behavior or your response.
I guess like the phrase "crime of passion," right, would kind of reflect that, right? When we think of what do we call a crime of passion, is where the person just sort of lost, because of a specific circumstance that emotionally or affected them in some way. They lost control of their senses or whatever, and did something, like something outside of them effectively caused them to do something. Right.
So they were overcome by their jealousy or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And of course, when you talk about God and you say, does he ever suffer? Is he ever overcome by some emotion that dominates him so that he changes the way he would respond and makes him respond in a certain way? I think everybody would say no. God does not suffer. God is never overcome by something external to him. And so the theologians throughout the history of the church have always said God is impassible, meaning, there's some theologians these days who are saying he's not, but they're few, and even though they're loud, they're the minority. And it's really dangerous to say that, and they don't get that. we don't get how dangerous it is. But so anyway, theologians throughout the church have always said God's impassible, and they've said it based on lots of things. There are biblical verses that say that. We'll look at one in a minute. But the idea that God suffers is just to be rejected. How could a perfect being suffer? Right? How can an almighty being suffer? So some people have said, well, Christ suffered and Christ is God, but that's a confusion, right? Of the attributes of one nature being applied to the other nature. That's a confusion there. Christ, as the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, does not suffer, but as a human, he dies. So,
Well, he cried and he sweated blood, and but that was the man.
Yeah, it's the humanity that is
Mhm.
suffering and dying there, right? It's not the person. It's not the
Mhm.
person of the second person of the Trinity. I say it like that. It's the person of the mediator, not the second person of the Trinity. God does not suffer. God does not die.
Right.
And
Right. And you talk to us on Tuesday mornings about the mediator, and that is so helpful to be able to, I mean, I'll never understand it completely, but being able to separate somebody who's inseparable is really helpful in getting that.
Yeah, especially with these questions like this, because Christians do get tripped up over, well, Christ suffered, and they get tripped up, but God doesn't suffer, God doesn't die. And so to attribute to God in his being things like regret, or because that's a form of suffering, grieving is a form of suffering, and regret, you attribute these things to God, they can't possibly mean what we think that word means. Because he doesn't suffer.
Well, we were created to be emotional beings, and it's very hard for us to take that step back and imagine that the one who created us as emotional beings not being emotional.
Yeah.
And it's just such a hard thing not only to grasp but to let go of.
Yeah.
And I think that part of what's happening here with Samuel is that God, of course, recognizes that difficulty, and so he talks to Samuel in a very emotional situation that Samuel is in, to guide him in through this.
Mm-hmm.
And Samuel can absolutely understand, I regret doing this.
Yeah, and the other thing the language does is it communicates to Samuel that Samuel's emotional response is not inappropriate.
Right.
Samuel should be encouraged when God says, I regret, because
Mhm.
Samuel is expressing human regret and anger over the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And God is saying, I'm right there with you. That's exactly the right way to respond to that. As a human, that's completely the right way.
Yep. Because Samuel was angry and he cried out to the Lord all that night.
Yeah. So let's look at Acts, book of Acts 14, 8 through 18. So that was Acts 14, 8 through 18. And this passage I'm going to bring in as about impassibility, about God and passions. Now at Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. So they totally misunderstood the situation, right? They have not got it. Paul's probably been preaching Jesus and the resurrection just like he always did. And these guys think, wow, these guys are gods. Verse 12, Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. Now that's comical, right? Here's this guy Zeus. And then the priest of Zeus, right? Now, who should know who Zeus is? Shouldn't it be the priest of Zeus? Shouldn't he know who Zeus is? So he's gonna offer sacrifices anyway. Verse 14. When the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, and he did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. So the important verse here, the whole section is great because it's just a really funny story. But verse 15, men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of like nature with you. This is the denial of God. They're saying, we're not God. We have the same nature as you. Shirley, do you have the passage there? Acts 14, verse 15.
Yeah, and saying, sir, why do you do these things? We are men of like passions with you, and preach unto you that you should turn from these vanities unto the living God, which made heaven and earth and the sea and all the things therein.
So do you see what the King James does there with this old theological language? We are also men of like passions. Like passions. But the ESV translates that like nature, right? We have the same beingness as you, but the King James is actually more correct. We have like passions. We have the same passions as you. We suffer. That's what they're saying. We suffer. We are overcome. You're being overcome right now with this crazy emotion. We're just like you. We're not gods. Ergo, God is never like that. He does not suffer under passions. He does, which is what passions means, to suffer. So this is one of the key texts for impassibility, is what the text actually says is men have passions. God doesn't. That's the implication of the text. And so we get, I think that's so interesting that Paul's entire argument for, you think I'm God? You're wrong about that. His whole argument is, I get carried away by my passions. God doesn't. And he says it in such a way that it should be self-evident to them that that is a conclusive argument. So anyway, that's one of the passages that we might go to talk about God's relationship to, all we have is we've got human emotions. We don't want to attribute those to God. And this passage makes it clear that it's wrong to do so. So God is, we don't want to project our imperfections on God. It's not imperfect to have emotions. That's the way God created us, and created us good. But it is imperfect to suffer. And we are finite, and we suffer, and we're limited. And we suffer under emotions that overcome us and things like that. So So anyway, I think that's a passage worth meditating on. I'm really thankful that we have lots of different translations. It's really good to be familiar with different translations on critical verses like this. The King James is so helpful here. And the reason that I know that that's what the King James says is because when I go to the Westminster Confession, chapter 1, it says God is without body, comma, parts, comma, or passions. The proof text they use is this one. So I wanted to use the Bible they were looking at, so I went back and looked at it at the King James. So,
Yeah, I've been checking on King James as well as we've been going through this, and it was interesting that the section on immutability, one of the passages used in King James, they use the word immutable.
well, they do. Which one was that?
Yeah, I'm not sure offhand. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of passages there. I don't recall which. It might have been a Deuteronomy one, I think.
Oh, is it maybe one of the ones about the rock?
Yeah, I'll try to find it.
Yeah, that would be cool. Let's see. Oh, yeah, King James, Hebrews 6, 16 to 18.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's verse 17 and 18. Wherein God willing more abundantly to show unto the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by two immutable things, in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation, etc. Yeah, there might be immutable in other places too. The King James was written in equivalent of 12th grade English. It's really one of the more well, my NIV is 6th grade, 6th to 8th grade.
Huh.
Yeah, Mom.
So besides the fact that immutable means unchangeable, doesn't the word itself also connote unmovable?
Yes. Yeah.
Which of course is unchangeable, but immovable.
Immovable. Right. Immovable and
Unchanging.
unchangeable. And yeah. So rock is really appropriate there, for that metaphor. So what we did tonight was we talked about that we showed that the Bible teaches that God is unchanging and unchangeable. We saw from Hebrews how that's really helpful for us for being confident in his promises, and it's obviously so. We talked about passages where God is said to change his mind or regret, and how we want to distinguish between passages that talk about God as he is, and the really easy ones for those are the ones that God says, I'm not a man, and talks about how he is. And we want to use those passages to help us understand the other passages that say God changes his mind and things like that. And when we do that, we realize that anthropomorphic language is being used there to describe the effect of what God is doing. It's the same effect that a man who regrets or changes his mind would have done. But we don't want to attribute anything from our finite beingness to God. So we don't want to say God. We don't want to actually say it's literal that God changed his mind. We don't want to say that, because that would be wrong, because God's not a man. And so we talked about those things, and then at the end we talked for about 10 minutes about impassibility. And even though I know that's culturally right now, that's a difficult thing to contemplate just because all the baggage in our culture, it's a biblical teaching. And if we understand what passions means, which means to suffer from something from the outside, that we know that God is unchanged and unchangeable, and certainly nothing from the outside can ever affect God like that. So, or affect God. So we then understand in the theological context what's being meant there by impassibility. So one of the other things we talked about, we briefly mentioned analogical language being helpful here and always necessary when we talk about God. And we're going to talk next week about accommodated language, which I brought up before, but it's also helpful here. So it is now 8:31. This study got off to a rocky start tonight with all the problems. So
And then
let's,
got hijacked.
yeah, it was almost hijacked. Yeah, so there's a paragraph on the outline at the bottom of page 5. And I'll just, it's about the interpretive guideline. I just want to read the paragraph so that I make sure I express it the way I wanted to. So thinking about God changes his mind or God doesn't change his mind, and the two sets of passages. The interpretive guideline is that we interpret the descriptive passages by the declarative passages. So the declarative passages are about who God is. The descriptions of God's activity are to be interpreted by the passages declaring his nature. Another way to say this is this. We use the biblical statements of the divine ontology, that is, the teaching about God's being, to help us understand the biblical descriptions of God's actions that otherwise would have been in conflict with the statements about his nature. So that's what I was trying to say. I guess if I had said that earlier.
Where is that in the outline? I can't find it.
It's not on the bottom. It's bottom of page 5.
Going on to page 6, top is page 6.
Yeah, 5 and 6.
Not on mine.
Oh, well, no wonder you didn't know what we were talking about. So it's under C, immutability. It's under point 2. It's 2A.
Oh, I see it. Okay.
Okay.
I was looking for a footnote. I thought you said the bottom of the page, so I was looking for footnote.
No. So it's right there.
Got it. Okay.
And then I know it's time to go, but I did want to mention this about immutability. Maybe I'll bring this up again next week because it's really important, or it's really easy to remember this. So I do want to talk about footnote 8 real quick. It says that if you remember our discussion about Aristotle's distinction between accidents and substance, he said the substance is the being and the accident are the incidental things attached to that being that if they were gone, it wouldn't change the being at all. So like my right arm is an accident according to Aristotle. If I lost it, I'd still be a human being. So that type of thing. God is pure being, 100% being, right? He has no accidents, no accidental or incidental qualities or characteristics or anything. Everything that God is, he has. He is 100% pure being. Now, the thing is, here's some accidents, human accidents. My color of my hair, color of my eyes, length of my hair, length of my fingers, that type of thing. These are all human accidents. Those are things that change about me. But my essential human nature never changes. Right? I'm always a human. But the color of my hair can change. The fact that I have hair can change. The length of my hair can change, that kind of thing. Even the color of my eyes changes depending on how healthy I am. That it all changes. But my being does not change. So my substance does not change. The accidents change. God has no accidents. Therefore, he cannot change. That's also a valid way of expressing that. So, does that make sense?
Mhm.
So if you're talking to somebody who's trained in philosophy, that's a really simple way to explain that. He doesn't have accidents. Accidents are changeable, but substance is not. So that makes it so easy. All right. Okay. Any other final thoughts before we turn off the recording for the last time? All right. Turning it off.